All right, guys, this is the lecture video for chapter 34. I went ahead and turned off my video because it was having some issues with it on the last video, so I'm just going to go ahead and hide it. So here, since we just learned about the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model, we're now going to look at ways that the government or the central bank, the Federal Reserve Bank, can influence our economy, and we're going to analyze how they can do that using the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. Now, this chapter and the last chapter are very important for your essay that's coming up soon. So make sure you pay close attention to the last chapter as well as this chapter, because you're really going to need to understand how these things work to do well on that essay. So as we go through this chapter, look for the answers to these questions. How does the interest rate effect help explain the slope of the aggregate demand curve? Something we actually already looked at, but we're going to revisit it because it's important when it comes to monetary policy. Monetary meaning money, and so monetary policy has to do with the money supply, as we will see shortly. Next, how can the central bank use monetary policy, changes in the money supply, to shift the aggregate demand curve? Also, in what two ways does fiscal policy affect aggregate demand? And lastly, what are the arguments for and against using policy to try to stabilize the economy? So actually, these questions are very pertinent to your essay. You're going to need to know and understand the answers to all of these questions to do well on your essay. So really be on the lookout for these answers. So earlier we've seen the long run effects of fiscal policy on interest rates, investment, and economic growth, as well as the long run effects of monetary policy on the price level and inflation. But here we're now going to focus on the short run effects of fiscal and monetary policy. By the way, fiscal just has to do with government spending and taxation. And both of these work through aggregate demand. So the short run effects come to fruition through their effects, the effects of these policies on aggregate demand. So let's review the aggregate demand curve real quick. Remember that it slopes downward for three reasons. The wealth effect, right? And that's because as the price level goes down, people's real wealth goes up. They can buy more with the money in their bank account if prices are lower. And so spending goes up. Another reason it's downward sloping is because of the interest rate effect. And that basically, has to do with the fact that when price level goes down, one of those prices are the price of borrowing money, which is an interest rate. So as the interest rate goes down, people borrow more money and spend that money. And then there's the exchange rate effect, which has to do with international trade. And when prices in the United States get lower, it means that things become more affordable for foreigners, and so they buy more of our stuff, so exports go up. And at the same time, it means that foreigners' stuff gets relatively more expensive compared to our own if our own prices have fallen. So we import less. And so when we export more and import less, net exports goes up. Now, the most important of these effects for the U.S. economy is the interest rate effect. And so we're actually going to use a simple supply and demand model to help explain the interest rate effect and how monetary policy affects aggregate demand. So we're actually going to do a little bit of microeconomics here to understand this. So going back to chapter 4. Okay, so we're basically doing something, we're using a model called the theory of liquidity preference. And this is a basic or simple theory of how the interest rate is determined, which we will denote R for interest rate. And in this model, the interest rate adjusts to balance the supply and demand for money. Now, where does this money supply come from? Well, that comes from the central bank. They decide what the money supply is going to be, and it does not depend on the interest rate. And so we're going to assume that it's simply fixed by the central bank, and therefore in our graph, it's going to be a vertical line. The supply of money is going to be a vertical line. Now, on the demand side of money, the money demand is reflecting how much wealth people want to hold in the form of cash or in their checking account, basically. How much wealth do they want to hold in a liquid form, meaning it's very easily convertible to cash. Now, of course, cash is cash, doesn't need to be converted, but checking accounts are very liquid. You can easily convert it to cash by either going to an ATM or writing yourself a check and cashing it at the bank. Very easy to do, right? Now, for simplicity, we're going to suppose that household wealth only includes two assets. People can either hold money, which is very liquid, but it doesn't pay any interest. So, you know, as we experience inflation, the value of that money goes down, basically. And then the other asset are bonds, which are basically IOUs, right? So you can purchase an IOU, you can purchase a bond, and it's kind of like if you loaned somebody money, but you don't actually have to do the loaning. You just buy the bond that represents the IOU, right? Now, the nice thing about bonds is that they pay interest, so their value does not diminish as much as just plain old cash. But unfortunately, the downside to bonds is that they're not as liquid. It's somewhat difficult to convert a bond into cash. And so, given these two assets that households hold, the money demand from a household is reflecting its preference for liquidity. How much liquidity does it want? How much liquidity does the household want? And the main variables that are going to influence money demand are GDP, the interest rate, and price level. Okay, so let's think about money demand a little bit more. So suppose that real income, or GDP, goes up. Now, assuming that everything else stays the same, what would happen to the demand for money? Well, if real income rises, then people want to buy more stuff. And in order to buy more stuff, you need more money. Right? So the demand for money would increase if income increased. Now, in order to get this money, they have to convert their bonds that they own into money. All right, and so the overall effect is that an increase in real income or real GDP causes an increase in money demand, assuming that everything else remains the same. Okay, so let's think about some other examples. Suppose the real interest rate or the interest rate rises, but GDP and price level are unchanged. What happens to money demand? Okay, we'll look at the answer in a second. Then we also want to think about another scenario. What if the price level rises, but GDP and the interest rate stay the same? What happens then to money demand? Okay, so let's go over the first one. The interest rate goes up, GDP and price level stay the same. What happens to money demand? Well, another way of thinking about the interest rate is that it's the opportunity cost of holding money, right? Because remember that money does not earn interest, right? If you just have a $20 bill lying on your desk, it's not earning interest, right? You could, although, take that $20 bill, buy a bond and earn interest, but then of course it's no longer money. You can't spend a bond to buy something. You would have to convert it into cash or money, which is relatively difficult. So there's a trade-off there, right? But by holding it in the form of money, you're giving up the opportunity to earn the interest rate that bond provides. So when the interest rate increases, it actually reduces the demand for money. People want to try to get interest on their assets, and so they take some of their money and they buy bonds with it, which reduces the demand for money, right? Households are going to attempt to buy bonds in order to take advantage of the higher interest rate, and that means that they're going to demand less money and more bonds. And so an increase in the interest rate causes a decrease in money demand, assuming that everything else remains the same. All right, what about price level? If the price level goes up, what happens to money demand? Now, if GDP, real income, is unchanged, people are going to want to buy the same amount of goods and services. But because the price level is higher, that amount of goods and services is going to cost more money. So they need more money to buy that same amount of goods and services. And so here, an increase in the price level causes an increase in money demand, holding everything else constant. Okay, so now let's turn to our supply and demand of this market, the market for money. So like we said earlier, the supply of money is determined by the Fed. They decide what the money supply is going to be, and it does not depend on the interest rate. It's fixed. And so for the money supply curve, we have a vertical line, which basically means that changes in the interest rate don't affect the money supply, right? Again, it's fixed by the Fed, the Federal Reserve Bank. The demand for money, however, is more like a normal demand curve. It's downward sloping. And that's because a fall in interest rates is, well, I shouldn't say increases the demand for money. It increases the quantity of money demanded. That's kind of a, what would you call it? Semantical issue, right? But it's important. So something going back to chapter 4, that's what we learned there. A change in price, which in this case, price is the interest rate. A change in price doesn't change or shift the demand curve. It just moves us along the curve, right? So we're going to start in some sort of equilibrium, basically, and we're going to look at the effects of different shocks. So the first shock is that there's a fall in the price level, right? Now remember that if prices go down and GDP remains the same, people are going to want to buy the same amount of stuff, but that stuff is now cheaper, so they don't need to spend as much money to buy that same amount of stuff, which means their demand for money will fall. Now this will shift the money demand curve to the left. And in the market for money, the money market, that will lead to a decrease in the interest rate. Okay, so we talked about, I guess, the opposite of this, right? Price level goes up, interest rate goes up. So this is the opposite. But basically, when there's a fall in the price level, there's a fall in the demand for money, which decreases interest rates. And as we've seen in the past, when there's a decrease in interest rates, it basically means that it's cheaper to borrow money. And so businesses in particular are going to borrow more money, make more investments, and therefore the quantity of goods and services demanded will increase and get us to a higher level of GDP. Okay, so that's actually what's going on. This is an illustration of the interest rate effect, explaining why the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping, right? So that's an illustration of the interest rate effect at work. Now, of course, like we saw, the money supply is determined by the Fed. So they can push that money supply curve around to change the interest rate, which will then change investment, which then changes aggregate demand. Okay, so if the Fed wants to achieve some certain macroeconomic goal, it can use monetary policy to shift the aggregate demand curve through the interest rate effect. Okay, so in this case, the Fed's policy instrument, the thing that it can move, or sometimes called the policy lever, the lever that it can pull is the money supply. It can change the money supply to affect the economy through the interest rate effect. Now, you may or may not have seen some things in the news about the Fed, but typically what the Fed does is it targets the interest rate, and in particular, it targets the federal funds rate, which, to remind you, is the interest rate that banks are allowed to charge one another on very, very short-term loans, typically just overnight loans. And so if the Federal Reserve wants to change the interest rate and shift the aggregate demand curve, what the Fed does is it conducts open market operations that we've already talked about, right? The buying and selling of government bonds in order to change the money supply. Okay, so for example, the Fed can raise interest rates by reducing the money supply. Okay, that causes interest rates to go up. And the increase in interest rates means it is more difficult, it's more expensive to borrow money. So fewer people, or I guess people, will borrow less money. And since they borrow less money, they buy fewer goods and services. Now, this doesn't come from a change in the price level like the previous example we saw. This came from a change in the money supply. So this actually shifts the aggregate demand curve to the left. Now, the way that the Fed would reduce the money supply is that they would sell bonds in open market operations, right? Sell bonds to banks. The banks would give the Fed money, and in that sense, the Fed would be taking money out of the economy, right? So they sell bonds in order to do this. Okay, so let's take a look at some practice examples. So for each of the events below, we want to determine the short-run effects on output. We want to determine how the Fed should adjust the money supply and interest rates in order to try to stabilize output. When Congress tries to balance the budget by cutting government spending, when there is a stock market boom that increases household wealth, and also when war breaks out in the Middle East, causing oil prices to soar. All right, with the first scenario, Congress tries to balance the budget by cutting government spending. Well, what does this do to our aggregate demand? We know that aggregate demand is consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. And so if Congress is cutting government spending, it's reducing government spending, and that reduces aggregate demand and output. Okay, now I encourage you to draw this in our aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, right, to verify that a reduction in aggregate demand would reduce GDP. It would also decrease the price level and increase unemployment. Now, the Fed can try to stabilize output, try to get it to go back up, in other words, to where it was, by conducting some monetary policy. And in this case, it should increase the money supply so that interest rates are lower, so that it's cheaper for people to borrow money, so that they borrow more money and spend more money, right, to increase aggregate demand. All right, what about the case of a stock market boom that increases households' wealth? Well, this would, when households are more wealthy, they have more money to spend, so they spend more. And this would increase aggregate demand, raising GDP above its natural rate, and it would also cause some inflation. And one of the goals of the Fed is to keep inflation at bay, to not necessarily minimize it, but to keep it low. So given that this increase in aggregate demand would start to push prices up, they might want to try to stabilize that, right? And in this case, they should decrease the money supply to increase the interest rate so that it's more expensive to borrow money. People borrow less money, they spend less money because of that, and that reduces aggregate demand, pushing us back to the left, closer to the long run equilibrium. And it helps bring prices back down, helps keep a lid on inflation. All right, what about the last one? War breaks out in the Middle East, causing oil prices to soar. So this is very much like the example of stagflation that we saw in the last chapter. This is going to reduce short-run aggregate supply, which causes GDP to fall. It also causes prices to increase. Now, in this case, the Fed, to stabilize output, could increase the money supply to reduce the interest rate and increase aggregate demand. But there is kind of a problem in this scenario, because in this scenario, we already have stagflation, right? We have GDP going down and prices going up. And when the Fed increases the money supply to increase aggregate demand, it pushes prices up further. So this is kind of a tough situation for the Fed, because it does want to stabilize output, but it also wants to stabilize inflation. And in this case, it would make inflation worse. So this is kind of a tough situation for the central bank. All right, so let's talk about a potential limitation to monetary policy, right? And it's called a liquidity trap. So remember that monetary policy, right, changing the money supply, monetary, money, changing the money supply can stimulate aggregate demand by reducing the interest rate. But there's a problem. There's a lower bound, there's a minimum interest rate, and that's zero. Interest rates, nominal interest rates at least, cannot go below zero. So if interest rates are already close to zero, the Fed cannot do much to decrease them further. And this is what's known as a liquidity trap. And when there is a liquidity trap, monetary policy might not work, since nominal interest rates can't be reduced any further, since they're already close to zero. But there is something the Fed can do, and that's that it can make real interest rates negative by raising inflation expectations, right? So getting people to believe that inflation is going to be higher in the near future, and that causes real interest rates to become negative. So they can at least push real interest rates below zero. Now, keep in mind that the way that the Fed does this is through open market operations. It does it by buying and selling bonds. In this case, to reduce the interest rate, it would buy bonds to put more money in the economy, increase the money supply. And so in these types of situations, there are other things that it can do. It can buy other assets, right? It doesn't only have to buy bonds. It can buy other assets like mortgages that we talked about in the last chapter, right? Loans on houses. It can also buy corporate bonds, or in other words, corporate debt, right? It doesn't just have to buy government debt. It can buy corporate debt, right? The debt of businesses. And by doing that, it can lower the interest rates on those kinds of loans, right? Which typically are much further from zero. And this is exactly actually what the Fed did during the Great Recession in 2008 and 2009. They bought those mortgage-backed securities. I don't know if they bought corporate debt at that time, but that is something they did in this last recession that was the result of the pandemic. They actually started buying the debt of businesses instead of just the debt of the government. Okay, so that's monetary policy. We'll come back to that in a second, but now let's talk a little bit about fiscal policy, which is government spending and government taxation. Right, that's what fiscal is all about. It's about the budget, right? Spending and taxes. Right, so like I said, this is the setting of the level of government spending and taxation, typically by Congress or some other governmental body, maybe it's a local government or a state government. Doesn't have to be the federal government per se, but it typically is because they have such power in terms of fiscal policy. They can spend a lot of money. They can also raise a lot of tax revenue. And so we have two types of fiscal policy, and actually these same terms apply to monetary policy as well. I don't know why the book and the slides don't go over it, but when the Fed increases the money supply to increase aggregate demand, that's called expansionary monetary policy. That's because it expands GDP, it expands the economy. The opposite is contractionary policy, and so contractionary monetary policy is when the Fed reduces the money supply to reduce aggregate demand, therefore contracting GDP, contracting the economy. But we also have these terms for fiscal policy. Okay, so if the government wants to expand the economy, it can either increase government spending or it can decrease taxes, right? Because if it decreases taxes, people have more money to spend on consumption or investment. Or it can do both, right? So it can do one or the other or both. And so if it increases if it increases government spending and or decreases taxes, then it shifts aggregate demand to the right, increasing aggregate demand, increasing GDP, also increasing the price level. So that's a trade-off, remember, but that's expansionary fiscal policy. The opposite is contractionary fiscal policy. How can the government contract the economy, make it smaller? And they can do that by doing the opposite. They can either decrease government spending and or increase taxes, and that shifts aggregate demand to the left. Now, there's two effects of fiscal policy on aggregate demand. First is called the multiplier effect. And the idea works something like this. Suppose that the government buys $20 billion worth of planes from Boeing, which means that Boeing's revenue, the money that it makes, increases by that same amount. Now, where does this money go? Well, it's distributed to Boeing's workers as wages, and it's also distributed to the owners of the company either as profits or stock dividends, which are basically profits distributed to shareholders. And so basically, the people that are directly affected by this make more money, right? These people, Boeing's workers and owners, are also consumers. And so this new income that comes from the government spending, they're going to spend at least a portion of it. And so the extra consumption that these workers and owners engage in further increases aggregate demand. So aggregate demand shifts by more than just the increase in government spending. It shifts further because the government spending becomes somebody else's income, which they then spend at least a fraction of that income. So if this is our aggregate demand and the government increases government spending by $20 billion, it's going to shift the aggregate demand curve to the right by 20 billion. But that's not the end of it. Because of the multiplier effect, the increase in income causes consumption to also rise, which further shifts aggregate demand to the right. And it potentially keeps going. But at each step, the additional increase becomes smaller and smaller and smaller. So there is a limit to this process, right? Because it doesn't even end here, right? Because when those Boeing employees and owners spend their money, that becomes the income of somebody else, and that person spends a fraction of that new income, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So to really understand what's behind this multiplier, we need to understand something called the marginal propensity to consume. Okay, and we'll talk about what exactly that means, but basically it's going to help us answer this question: how big is the multiplier effect? Well, it depends on MPC. In other words, how much consumers respond to increases in income. So the marginal propensity to consume is defined as the fraction of extra income that households consume or spend rather than save. Okay, so for example, if MPC equals 0.8 and somebody's income goes up by $100, then consumption will go up by $80, right? 80% of 100, or 0.8 times 100 is 80. So if your own MPC is 0.8 and you make, let's just say you find $100 on the ground. You don't even make it necessarily. If your MPC is 0.8, then you're going to spend $80 of that $100 and then save the other $20. Now, with this concept, we can determine how big the multiplier is. We actually have a formula for it. Okay, so just a little bit of notation so that we can clearly describe this formula. Delta G, that triangle is the Greek letter delta, uppercase delta, and it stands for change. So delta G means the change in G, or the change in government spending. And likewise, delta Y is the change in GDP, and delta C is the change in consumption. We're also going to need our GDP equation. And in this case, we are assuming that investment and net exports don't change. And so that any change in GDP is only coming from either a change in consumption or a change in government spending. Now we can rewrite delta C as MPC times delta Y, right? So again, in that previous example, delta Y was 100, and if MPC is 0.8, then the change in consumption is $80, right? So we just rewrote that second equation there. And now we have basically one equation with two variables, and we can rewrite it. We can re-express it as delta Y equals 1 over 1 minus MPC times delta G. And this thing right here is the spending multiplier, the government spending multiplier. It tells us how big the multiplier effect is. So this multiplier, as we can see, depends on MPC. So for example, if MPC was, say, 0.5, then we would have 1 divided by 1 minus 0.5, which is on the bottom there is just 0.5, and 1 divided by 0.5 is 2. So in this case, our multiplier is 2. What if MPC is a little bit higher, 0.75? Well, in that case, we get 1 minus 0.7, and so on the bottom here we have 0.25, and 1 divided by 0.25 is 4. So in this case, our multiplier is 4. If MPC is 0.9, our multiplier is 10. Okay, so we can see how the multiplier changes as MPC changes. And we can even see that there's a pretty clear relationship. As MPC gets bigger, so does the multiplier, right? A bigger MPC means that changes in income cause bigger changes in consumption, which in turn cause bigger changes in GDP. So it's kind of like a feedback loop, if you know what that is. All right, what about some other applications of this effect? So think about a $1 increase in government spending. Because of the multiplier effect, that means that that can generate more than $1 increase in aggregate demand. And this is also true for the other components of GDP. It's not only true for government spending, it's true for all of the other components. So suppose that, for example, there's a recession in some other country overseas, and that reduces the demand for US net exports by $10 billion. Initially, as a result of that first shock, aggregate demand falls by 10 billion. Well, this causes GDP to fall, which causes consumption to fall, and so aggregate demand and income falls even further. Okay? So that's the first effect of fiscal policy, is the multiplier effect. The second effect, by the way, the multiplier effect basically amplifies fiscal policy. That's a good way to think about it. The crowding out effect has the opposite effect. It actually dampens the effect of fiscal policy. Okay, it works in the opposite direction. And basically what happens here is that when the government spends more money, a lot of times the way that it gets that money is by borrowing. Okay, so it borrows that money, and so effectively it increases the demand for money in our liquidity theory of liquidity preference model. It increases the demand for money, and when that happens, interest rates go up. And when interest rates go up, investment goes down, which means that there is a smaller increase in aggregate demand than there would be if there was no crowding out effect. Okay, so it reduces the net increase in aggregate demand, because the increase in government spending will increase aggregate demand, but there's going to be a reduction in investment that decreases aggregate demand. Okay, so basically what this means is that the size of the aggregate demand shift may be smaller than the initial fiscal expansion, and this is, again, known as crowding out. The government is crowding out private spending or private investment. All right, let's see how this works in our theory of liquidity preference model paired with the, well, I guess this is not the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, but we can see the effect on aggregate demand here. All right, so again, if the government spends a bunch of money, it initially shifts the aggregate demand curve to the right by 20 billion. But the higher GDP, along with the government's demand for money, increases the money demand, which increases R, the interest rate, which reduces aggregate demand. So the aggregate demand curve actually shifts back to the left a little bit. Okay, so again, the crowding out effect has a dampening effect on fiscal policy, whereas the multiplier effect has an amplifying effect on fiscal policy. All right, now at this point, we've only talked about government spending, but what about changes in taxes? What happens there? A tax cut means that people take more money home on their paycheck. They have more money to spend if their taxes are lower, right? If there's a tax cut. And so households will respond by spending a portion of this extra income. In fact, they will spend an amount dictated by the marginal propensity to consume, the MPC. And so this shifts the aggregate demand curve to the right. Now, the size of this shift is affected by the multiplier as well as crowding out effects. But there is another factor to consider here, and that's whether households believe the tax cut is temporary or if they believe it's permanent. If they believe it's permanent, this will cause a bigger increase in consumption because they don't think that it's temporary, right? It's a permanent tax cut. And so a bigger increase in consumption will lead to a bigger shift in the aggregate demand curve. And those shifts will be bigger than a temporary tax cut, because if people believe it's temporary, they might actually just save that money so that they can pay taxes in the future when they're higher again. Okay, so let's look at another example. Suppose the economy is in a recession, and that shifting the aggregate demand curve to the right by $200 billion would end the recession. If MPC is 0.8 and there is no crowding out, how much should Congress increase G by to end the recession? So for this one, you're going to need to calculate the multiplier using MPC, and then use that multiplier to figure out how much the government would have to spend to increase aggregate demand by 200 billion. And then next, if there is crowding out, will Congress need to increase G more or less than this amount? And that's a little easier to answer. So let's go over the first one, right? Again, you have to first calculate the multiplier, which is 1 divided by 1 minus MPC, which in this case is 0.8. 1 minus 0.8 is 0.2, and 1 divided by 0.2 equals 5. So the multiplier is 5. And so any government spending that occurs will be multiplied by 5. So basically what we need to do is take the 200 billion that's required to end the recession and divide it by 5, which gives us 40. Right? Again, because the government spending will be multiplied by 5 times, and we want to get a $200 billion increase in aggregate demand. Now, if there is crowding out, then Congress will actually need to increase government spending by more than this, because crowding out reduces the impact of government spending on aggregate demand, and so they need to increase G by a larger amount if there is crowding out. Now, most economists believe that the short-run effects of fiscal policy mainly work through aggregate demand, but fiscal policy can also affect aggregate supply, sometimes called supply-side fiscal policy. And before we think about this and how it works, remember from chapter 1 that one of our 10 principles is that people respond to incentives. So with that in mind, think about a tax cut. A tax cut gives workers an incentive to work more because they're getting more for their work, basically, right? So you can imagine, an extreme case where the government takes all of your money. They tax you at 100%. Would you have any incentive to work? Hopefully your answer is no, right? If the government's taking all of my money, why on earth would I work? I wouldn't. So you can think then from that extreme example that as they reduced the tax rate, the incentive to work starts to increase. Okay, so if there's a tax cut, there's a bigger incentive for workers to work more. And so it might actually increase the quantity of goods and services supplied, which would be represented by a shift of the aggregate supply curve to the right. So economists who believe that this effect is large are called supply-siders for supply-side fiscal policy. Another example of how fiscal policy might affect aggregate supply is through government purchases. So how could government purchases affect aggregate supply? Well, a good example is spending on roads, right? If we didn't have roads that were maintained and built by the government, production would be a lot harder. I mean, we would have semi-trucks driving on dirt roads. It would take you hours to get to work instead of 30 or 40 minutes, right? So better roads help increase business productivity, which increases the quantity of goods and services supplied, which shifts the aggregate supply curve to the right. So this is another example of supply-side fiscal policy. Now, we should keep in mind that this effect is probably more relevant in the long run because it does take quite a bit of time to build new roads and put them into use, but nevertheless, this is a way that fiscal policy can affect the supply side of the economy. Okay, so now let's begin to look at how the Fed and the government can use these policies, monetary policy and fiscal policy, to stabilize the economy. Now, ever since the Employment Act of 1946, economic stabilization has been the primary goal of U.S. policy. Now, there is a lot of debate still on how active a role the government should take in order to stabilize the economy. So let's talk about those arguments. So first we'll talk about arguments for active stabilization. And this is mainly coming from that guy Keynes that we learned about last time in the last chapter. So Keynes argued that people are prone to animal spirits. And what he meant by that is that we are prone to waves of pessimism and optimism, both among firms and households. And so when we think we're heading into the storm, we get really pessimistic and we start saving our money and not spending a lot, and we stop doing things, right, in preparation for the storm. And that affects aggregate demand. Or when we think times are going to be really great, we start spending money like crazy and going out all the time and doing all sorts of stuff, buying all sorts of things, and that affects aggregate demand as well. And these shifts in aggregate demand are what are the primary cause of fluctuations in the economy. So that was Keynes' main argument. But there might also be other factors that can cause fluctuations, such as booms and recessions in other countries, stock market booms and crashes, right? So those are some other factors that cause fluctuations. And if the government and the Fed don't do anything, right, if policymakers don't do anything, these fluctuations can be destabilizing to businesses, workers, and consumers. It makes it really hard in these conditions to have a successful economy. So Keynes would say, yeah, let's actively stabilize the economy. And so proponents of active stabilization believe that the government should use policy to reduce these fluctuations, make them less severe. So that, for example, when GDP falls below its natural rate, the government should use either expansionary monetary policy or expansionary fiscal policy or both to try to prevent or at least reduce the severity of the recession. And similarly, but the opposite case, when GDP goes above its natural rate, the government should use contractionary policies to prevent or reduce an inflationary boom. Okay, lots of examples of Keynesians in the White House. John F. Kennedy had lots of Keynesian economic advisors. He pushed for a tax cut to stimulate aggregate demand, right? That's a Keynesian principle. Let's actively stabilize the economy with government policies, in this case, a tax policy. Barack Obama was also heavily influenced by Keynesians. He pushed for spending increases and tax cuts to increase aggregate demand in the face of a deep recession back in 2008 and 2009. All right, so what is the case against active stabilization? Well, one issue is that monetary policy takes a long time to start to affect the economy. There's a long lag. So the Fed might change the money supply today, but the effects won't be occurring until months later. The same is true for fiscal policy, which we'll see in a second. But with monetary policy, right, this is primarily affecting the interest rate, which affects investment. And so thinking about that, firms typically make investment plans pretty far in advance. And so investment takes time to respond to these changes in the interest rate. And in fact, most economists believe it takes at least 6 months for monetary policy to affect output and employment. But monetary policy isn't the only thing that has a lagged effect. Fiscal policy also has a lag, right? Any changes in government spending or taxes require an act of Congress. And as we all know, Congress has a hard time coming to an agreement, to a consensus. So this process can be particularly long, right? The legislative process can take months or perhaps even years. And so by the time the effects of the policies come to fruition, we may be in an entirely different situation, right? Maybe the recession already ended by the time the policies start to have an effect. Well, that's going to push us into an inflationary boom, which is further destabilizing, right? So it's almost a game of, chasing your own tail, I guess. Right? So due to these long lags, critics of active policy argue that such policies might actually destabilize the economy rather than help it. And that's because by the time the policies affect aggregate demand, the economy's conditions may have already changed. And so typically these critics say that policymakers should focus on long-run goals like economic growth and low inflation. Now there is a silver lining here, and that has to do with something called automatic stabilizers. So these are changes in fiscal policy that stimulate aggregate demand when the economy goes into a recession, or vice versa, constrict aggregate demand when the economy goes into an inflationary boom, without policymakers having to make any deliberate action, without having to make a decision. So this helps to eliminate that fiscal policy lag, and it makes the policy have a quicker effect. So what are some examples? Our tax system is an example. We have a progressive tax system, which means that if you make more money, you pay higher tax rates. And that happens automatically. That's not something that the government has to decide on, right? So in a recession, taxes automatically fall because people make less money, and so they pay lower tax rates. And this stimulates aggregate demand, right? A tax cut is a expansionary fiscal policy. There's also examples in government spending. During a recession, more people apply for public assistance, things like welfare and unemployment insurance. And in a recession, more people apply for this funding, and so government spending on these programs automatically goes up, which stimulates aggregate demand as well. So fortunately, despite these policy lags, we do have these automatic stabilizers that help to eliminate those policy lags. Okay, so everything in this chapter is super relevant to your essay, right? We talked about how monetary policy works. We talked about how fiscal policy works. We talked about how to draw that in our aggregate demand, aggregate supply curve. We also talked about the problems or issues with these policies and some potential fixes to those problems, right, with automatic stabilizers. So you're basically going to have to talk about everything we learned in this chapter in your essay, okay, in order to do well on it. So to conclude, right, these policymakers in the government and the Federal Reserve need to consider all of the effects of their actions, right? So, for example, when Congress cuts taxes, it should consider not only the short run effects on aggregate demand and employment, but they should also be thinking about the long run effects on savings, growth, and inflation, perhaps even. And likewise, when the Fed reduces the rate of money growth, it needs to take into account not only the long run effects on inflation, but also the short run effects on output and employment. All right. Okay, so that's the chapter on monetary and fiscal policy. We've got one more week of class where we will talk about the great debates in macroeconomic policy. Basically, talk about sort of what are the disagreements that still occur. Where do economists not see eye to eye? That sort of thing. But you do need to be working on your essay. Okay, so that's posted in Moodle. I'll post a reminder in the announcements about that, but you need to be working on your essay, and also you need to get started on preparing for your final exam, as well as your third exam, I think, which is coming up. But in any case, I'll post you a reminder about all those things as soon as I can get back into Moodle, and if I need to make any adjustments to due dates because of this technical difficulty that we're experiencing, I'll go ahead and do that and make an announcement about that as well. So, and as always, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact me either by email or text, and I will be happy to respond to you as quickly as I can. But in any case, start mentally preparing for the end of the term. You've got that essay, you've got a final exam, and one more exam, one more midterm exam. So just be mentally preparing for those things, and hopefully I will see you next Thursday. Of course, as long as there's no technical difficulties. So hopefully they'll get everything fixed, and we can meet one last time next Thursday. So. I hope you all have a good weekend, and I will see you soon.